Morning crept weakly through the blinds of Claire Johnson's small apartment, painting the peeling wallpaper in pale gray light. She had barely slept, her body aching from rocking two restless children through the night. Her twins, Ethan and Lily, lay curled in their crib, finally at peace. Claire stood over them, brushing damp hair from their foreheads, her heart heavy with fear of what the future held. Then came the knock. Sharp, deliberate, unexpected. Claire froze, her hand hovering protectively over her son's back. Visitors were rare. Most neighbors kept their distance, and friends had long since vanished when her struggles grew too heavy to witness. She pulled her sweater tighter, nerves prickling as the knock came again. When she opened the door, she nearly lost her breath. Standing in the narrow hallway was Richard Hamilton. She recognized him instantly. Everyone in New York knew his name. He was the elusive billionaire investor, a man whispered about in boardrooms and featured in glossy magazines, though rarely seen outside of charity galas. Tall, broad-shouldered, with streaks of silver in his dark hair and eyes as steady as steel, Richard was the kind of presence that commanded silence. But what stunned Claire wasn't his wealth or reputation. It was the fact that he was standing at her door. "Claire Johnson?" His voice was deep, calm, carrying a weight that made her feel both wary and strangely safe. She swallowed hard, gripping the doorframe. "Yes, I'm Claire. But why are you here?" Richard's gaze flicked past her into the apartment, taking in the clutter of toys, the crib in the corner, the evidence of struggle etched into every detail of her life. His jaw tightened, but his eyes softened as they met hers again. "Because I know what he did to you," he said quietly, "and I can't stand by and watch it happen." Suspicion flared in Claire's chest. "If Nathan sent you?" "He didn't," Richard interrupted firmly. "I'm here because I've seen this story before. My father abandoned my mother when she was sick. She died alone, raising me with nothing. Years later, I watched my wife fight cancer until it claimed her. I know what betrayal does to a woman's spirit, and I promised myself I would never stand by and do nothing when I saw it happening again." Claire's throat tightened. She had braced herself for pity, for judgment, but what she saw in his eyes was neither. It was recognition, pain that mirrored her own. "I don't want your charity," she whispered, ashamed of the tremor in her voice. Richard shook his head. "This isn't charity. This is justice. Nathan thinks he can flaunt his cruelty without consequence. He's wrong. You don't have to fight this battle alone." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Claire's heart pounded, torn between disbelief and a fragile hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Why would a man like him, with all his wealth and power, care about her? And yet something in his presence told her this was no game, no cruel trick. "I can't walk into that wedding," she whispered. "Not like this. Not when he wants me broken." Richard's expression softened, but his words were iron. "Then don't walk in as his victim. Walk in as the woman he underestimated. Let me help you." Tears pricked Claire's eyes, but for the first time in years, they weren't only from despair. They carried something else, something fragile, dangerous, and life-changing. Hope. And with Richard Hamilton at her side, Nathan Brooks' trap was about to snap shut. Not on Claire, but on him. The day of Nathan's wedding dawned gray and cold, the kind of morning that mirrored Claire's nerves. She stood at the window of her cramped apartment, holding her daughter Lily, while Ethan tugged at her sweater with tiny fists. The gold-trimmed wedding invitation still lay on the table, mocking her with its promise of humiliation. Every part of her wanted to crumble, to give in to the fear that she would never be enough. But then came the low, smooth purr of an engine outside. Claire peeked through the blinds and froze. A sleek black limousine gleamed at the curb, polished so perfectly it reflected the gray clouds above. Standing beside it was Richard Hamilton, sharp in a tailored suit, his presence as commanding as the car itself. "Ready?" he asked gently when she opened the door, his gaze steady but kind. Claire shook her head. "I can't, not like this." Richard's lips curved in a faint smile. "Not like this? That's why we're changing everything." The limousine door opened to reveal more than leather seats and soft music. Inside sat a stylist with a rack of gowns shimmering in silk and satin, a makeup artist with brushes ready, and a jeweler's case that caught the light like fire. Claire gasped, clutching Lily closer. "This is too much," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't belong in any of this." Richard leaned closer, his tone quiet but firm. You belong more than anyone, Claire. This isn't about luxury. It's about walking into that ballroom with the dignity he tried to steal from you. Consider it armor. At first, Claire resisted. Her hands trembled as she touched the gowns, convinced she would look ridiculous in something so beautiful. But when she slipped into a deep sapphire dress, the air shifted. The fabric hugged her curves, the color made her eyes glow, and for the first time in years, the woman staring back in the mirror wasn't a weary single mother. She was someone powerful, someone whole. The makeup artist brushed away the shadows of sleepless nights. Soft curls framed her face, and a diamond pendant, Richard's gift, rested against her collarbone, glowing like a quiet promise. Claire touched it nervously. Do you like it? Richard asked. She shook her head quickly. It's too much. I can't accept. It's not a gift, he interrupted gently. It's protection. A reminder that tonight, you're not alone. Her twins clapped their tiny hands, dressed in miniature tuxedos and a sparkling dress that made them look like little royals. Mommy, you look like a princess, Ethan shouted proudly, and Lily echoed him with a squeal of delight. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. For so long her children had only seen her weary, dressed in faded clothes, her face etched with worry. Tonight, they would see her as the woman she was meant to be. As the limousine rolled toward the plaza, Claire's palms dampened with fear. She imagined Nathan's smug smile, Sophie's cruel laughter, the whispering guests. Her heart pounded. Richard leaned closer, his voice low, steady. Do you know what makes a storm powerful, Claire? It doesn't ask permission, it just arrives. And tonight, you are that storm. She let out a shaky laugh, clinging to his words. For years, she had been shrinking, hiding, just surviving. But not tonight. Tonight, she would not walk into Nathan's trap as his broken ex-wife. She would walk in as the queen he never believed she could be, and she would not walk alone. The Plaza Hotel sparkled like a jewel that evening, its gilded doors opening to a steady stream of limousines. Paparazzi crowded the steps, shouting names as celebrities, politicians, and high-powered investors strutted inside. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers bathed the space in golden light, while towering arrangements of white roses perfumed the air. The string quartet played Mozart as waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne and oysters across marble floors. At the center of it all stood Nathan Brooks, groom of the hour, basking in the glow of his own arrogance. Dressed in a custom-tailored tuxedo, he laughed too loudly, shook hands too firmly, and soaked in every envious glance thrown his way. He wanted tonight to scream wealth and triumph, and to Nathan, appearances were everything. Beside him, Sophie Miller glided across the floor in her designer gown, dripping with diamonds. She was radiant, not just with beauty, but with the smugness of victory. She had clawed her way from modeling for catalogs to standing in the plaza's ballroom as the bride of a powerful man. Tonight, she wasn't just marrying Nathan, she was erasing Claire. Sophie leaned closer to Nathan, whispering through a painted smile. Do you think she'll come? Nathan smirked, raising his glass. Of course she will. Pride always gets the better of her, and when she does, she'll be the shadow in the room while we shine in the spotlight. Their guests laughed, clinking glasses. A few whispered in the corners, curious about the infamous ex-wife who had been invited. Some predicted she wouldn't dare show her face. Others chuckled, imagining her slipping in with a borrowed dress, looking tired and poor. Nathan relished every rumor. He pictured Claire standing awkwardly at the back of the ballroom, clutching her children, her eyes full of shame. He imagined Sophie glowing beside him, every camera capturing the contrast. It was exactly the humiliation he wanted. The orchestra swelled as the officiant prepared for the ceremony. Sophie posed for the photographers, tilting her face to the light like she had rehearsed. Nathan shook hands with investors, boasting about new deals and hinting at expansion plans. The ballroom buzzed with shallow laughter, every guest eager to be seen in the right circles. But beneath the glamour, tension simmered. The empty chair Nathan had ordered placed near the back stood like a silent dare. Every glance toward it carried the same question. Would Claire come? Sophie reveled in the thought of it. When she walks through those doors, she whispered to Nathan, I want the cameras ready. I want her caught in every shot of us. Let the tabloids feast on her misery. Nathan chuckled, smug as ever. Don't worry. Tonight, everyone will see what I gained and what she lost. The room sparkled with anticipation, but no one noticed how the energy had shifted, how the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Because outside the plaza, a limousine was gliding toward the golden entrance. And inside, Nathan raised his glass high, convinced that this was the night he would finally erase Claire Johnson. What he didn't know was that his carefully staged triumph was seconds away from becoming the most humiliating downfall of his life. The golden doors of the plaza's ballroom swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that silenced the string quartet mid-note. Heads turned, whispers fell flat, and for a heartbeat, the grand hall seemed to freeze. All eyes shifted toward the entrance, toward the woman no one expected to see like this. Claire Johnson stepped inside, radiant in a sapphire gown that shimmered beneath the chandeliers like the night sky itself. Her hair, once tied back in practical knots, cascaded in soft curls that framed her glowing face. Around her neck gleamed a diamond pendant, delicate yet commanding, and in her steady gaze burned a strength that no poverty could erase. But what truly stole the room's breath wasn't her dress or her jewels. It was the image of family she carried with her. In one arm, Claire held her son Ethan, dressed in a miniature tuxedo that made him look like a prince. In her other arm, little Lily clung to her, wrapped in a satin dress trimmed with lace. Their tiny eyes sparkled, their innocence disarming the most cynical onlooker. And walking beside her, tall and unshakable, was Richard Hamilton. The billionaire's presence radiated authority, his tailored suit perfect, his stride confident, his hand resting protectively on Claire's back. He didn't just escort her. He stood with her, as though daring the entire room to try and diminish the woman he had chosen to support. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Phones lifted discreetly, cameras clicked, and whispers filled the air. "Is that Richard Hamilton? She came with him? Impossible. She looks like royalty." Nathan Brooks's smirk faltered, his glass trembling slightly in his hand. He had imagined Claire entering hunched, ashamed, maybe in a worn dress, her poverty laid bare. Instead, she glided across the marble floor like a queen returning to her throne. Sophie's face drained of color, her painted smile stiffening into something brittle. She clutched Nathan's arm tighter, her nails digging into his sleeve. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she hissed under her breath. The string quartet, recovering from their stunned silence, stumbled back into a melody, but the music was drowned out by the murmurs. Guests craned their necks, captivated by the transformation. Some whispered admiration, others awe, but all of them saw what Nathan had tried to bury. Claire was not broken, she was luminous. Richard guided her to the center of the room, not to the empty chair at the back Nathan had prepared for her, but straight toward the heart of the celebration. His very presence was a statement. Claire belonged here, not as a shadow, but as the light itself. Claire's heart pounded, but she held her chin high. Every step echoed the vow she had made to her children. "I will not let him erase us." She could feel Nathan's eyes burning into her, but she didn't look away. Not this time. As she reached the center of the ballroom, silence fell again, heavy and expectant. Nathan's voice cracked as he forced a laugh. "Well, looks like the guest of honor has arrived." But no one laughed with him, because in that moment, the balance of power shifted. And for the first time, Nathan Brooks realized his perfect night had just turned into his greatest nightmare. For a long, breathless moment, the ballroom of the plaza held its silence. Guests who had been laughing into champagne flutes now stood frozen, their eyes fixed on Claire Johnson and the billionaire at her side. It was as though a queen had stepped into their midst, her gown flowing like liquid sapphire, her children symbols of innocence and resilience. Then came the whispers. "Isn't that his ex-wife? She looks incredible. And Richard Hamilton? He never appears with anyone, ever. Why would he walk in with her?" The questions spread like sparks on dry grass. Suddenly, Nathan Brooks's carefully orchestrated spectacle was no longer about his triumph. It was about Claire's transformation. Nathan forced a smile, his jaw stiff, his mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Claire wasn't supposed to look radiant. She wasn't supposed to stand tall. She wasn't supposed to arrive with Richard Hamilton, of all people, the one man whose presence could eclipse Nathan's wealth in an instant. Sophie clung to his arm, her nails digging deeper. "Do something," she hissed through clenched teeth. Everyone's looking at her, not me. Nathan raised his glass, attempting a toast to regain control. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice overly bright, what a surprise. My ex-wife decided to join us tonight. Let's all welcome her, though I suppose she could use the attention. A few nervous chuckles escaped the crowd, but most guests exchanged uneasy glances. The words rang hollow, bitter. Nathan had meant them to sting Claire, but instead, the cruelty in his tone exposed something uglier: insecurity. Meanwhile, Claire remained composed. She didn't flinch, didn't shrink. Richard's steady hand on her back grounded her, while her twins squirmed in her arms, unaware of the storms swirling around them. She met Nathan's eyes for the briefest moment, not with fear, but with calm defiance. That look shook him more than he admitted. "Do you see the way she carries herself?" whispered one investor to another. "Nathan always said she was nothing. She doesn't look like nothing to me." "She looks more dignified than Sophie," another murmured, eyeing the bride's forced smile. The tide of opinion was shifting, and Nathan could feel it slipping like sand through his fingers. He tugged Sophie closer, trying to laugh as though he was still in control, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. His grand plan, to display Claire as weak, poor, and irrelevant, was unraveling before his eyes. Sophie leaned in again, her whisper sharp. "If you don't fix this, tonight is ruined. She's making a fool of us." Nathan's temples throbbed. He had built this night brick by brick, every detail designed to flaunt his superiority. And yet, in less than 5 minutes, Claire's presence had stolen the narrative. No one was marveling at Sophie's gown or Nathan's success. They were marveling at Claire's rebirth. He tried to speak again, to charm, to redirect attention, but his voice wavered. "Claire," he said loudly, "you look, well, I suppose Richard's money does wonders." This time the room didn't laugh at all. A heavy silence fell, followed by more murmurs, judgmental, disapproving. It was clear to everyone, Nathan's mask of confidence was cracking. And as Claire held her head high, something undeniable spread through the ballroom. Nathan Brooks hadn't humiliated his ex-wife. He had just humiliated himself. The ballroom was thick with tension. Nathan's bitter jab had landed poorly, his attempt at humor collapsing into silence. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some raising their glasses to hide their expressions, others whispering behind manicured hands. All eyes turned to Claire, waiting to see if she would shrink under the weight of humiliation. But Claire Johnson didn't shrink. She adjusted the diamond pendant at her neck, shifted Ethan higher on her hip, and smiled softly, her eyes steady. Her voice, clear and calm, carried across the marble floor. "You're right, Nathan. Money does change things, but not in the way you think. What changed me wasn't a man's fortune. It was raising 2 children on my own. It was learning to fight for them when no one else would. That's what gave me strength." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her words weren't sharp or cruel. They were truthful, undeniable, and truth carried more weight than any insult Nathan could hurl. Sophie's face hardened. She had expected Claire to stutter, to wilt, to walk out in shame. Instead, Claire glowed in front of the cameras, her poise undeniable. Sophie leaned closer to Nathan, whispering, "She's stealing the spotlight. I won't let her." With deliberate grace, Sophie stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble. She plastered on her brightest smile, though her eyes gleamed with venom. "How touching," she said loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. The abandoned wife's speech. So brave. "But let's be honest, Claire, you didn't raise those children alone. You probably begged for help at every corner. Isn't that right?" Murmurs rippled again. The cruelty in Sophie's tone was sharper, more reckless than Nathan's. Some guests frowned, shifting uneasily. Others leaned in, eager for drama. Claire's heart pounded, but she stood firm. She looked directly at Sophie, her voice steady, calm. "Yes, I asked for help sometimes. Do you know why? Because real strength isn't pretending you can do everything alone. Real strength is putting pride aside when it means protecting your children." Applause broke out. Not loud, but genuine, a handful of guests nodding in agreement. Sophie's painted smile faltered. She hadn't expected the room to side with Claire. Richard Hamilton, silent until now, stepped forward, his presence commanding instant respect. His voice was deep, even. "And for the record, Sophie, Claire never begged. She worked. She sacrificed. While others spent their nights in champagne-soaked parties, she spent hers cleaning floors to feed her children. That, ladies and gentlemen, is resilience. That is dignity. The ballroom erupted in murmurs again, this time more supportive. A few guests even clapped softly. Sophie flushed crimson, her composure slipping. She turned sharply to Nathan, hissing, "Do something!" But Nathan was frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting nervously as he felt the crowd slipping away. Claire shifted her gaze back to Sophie, her smile calm but cutting. "You wanted to erase me tonight, Sophie, but here I am, and the more you try to diminish me, the more you reveal who you truly are." The words hung in the air like a blade. Guests exchanged knowing glances. For the first time, Sophie's glittering image cracked under the weight of public scrutiny. Nathan swallowed hard, feeling the tide turn completely against him. His plan to humiliate Claire had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly, and in that moment it was clear. The battle lines were drawn, and Sophie had just lost the first round. The applause for Claire's words faded into murmurs, but the damage was already done. Nathan Brooks felt it like a crack spreading through glass, silent at first, but widening with every second. The ballroom, once his stage, no longer revolved around him. Instead, whispers circled the room like sharks scenting blood. He lifted his champagne glass again, forcing a grin, but his hand trembled slightly. "Well," he chuckled weakly, "I suppose my ex-wife has learned how to give speeches. Let's not forget why we're here tonight, to celebrate love." The words fell flat. No one laughed. Guests turned away, uninterested in his attempt to regain control. And then Richard Hamilton spoke. "Love?" His deep voice cut through the room, steady and sharp. "Is that what this is, Nathan? Love? Or a performance to cover the truth?" A hush fell. Nathan's face paled. "What the hell are you implying?" Richard stepped forward, his presence commanding, his gaze locked on Nathan like a predator circling prey. "I've watched you parade yourself as a success, Nathan, but the truth is far less glamorous. You've built your empire on lies, on exploitation, on fraud. And I have the proof." Gasps erupted. Cameras clicked. Every eye turned back to Nathan, who sputtered, his smug composure slipping into panic. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. But Richard didn't flinch. He pulled a sleek leather folder from his jacket and laid it on a nearby table. Inside are documents showing how you siphoned money from investors, how you inflated profits, how you used Claire's name and resources when it suited you, and discarded her when you thought she had no value left. Murmurs turned into open outrage. Investors in the crowd leaned forward, eyes narrowing, whispering furiously to one another. Nathan's throat went dry. "That's a lie," he barked, his voice cracking. "This is slander." Richard's gaze was unshakable. "Call it what you want, but I've already shared copies with the SEC and with several of your board members in this very room. Tonight isn't just your wedding, Nathan. It's the beginning of your reckoning." The crowd erupted. Guests pulled out their phones, checking emails, messages, headlines already beginning to circulate. Nathan's vision blurred with rage and fear. He turned desperately to Sophie, but she had gone pale, her grip loosening on his arm. "This isn't true, Sophie," he whispered harshly. "Tell them it isn't true." But Sophie's eyes darted between Nathan and Richard, calculating. She had always loved Nathan's power, not Nathan himself. And if that power was slipping, so was her loyalty. Claire stood silently, her children in her arms, watching it all unfold. She didn't need to add a word. Richard's truth carried more weight than her years of suffering ever could. Nathan slammed his glass onto the table, the sound shattering the air. "You think you can ruin me here, Hamilton? In my moment, I'll crush you. I'll crush both of you." But his outburst only deepened the cracks. Guests recoiled, whispers rising louder, respect dissolving into disgust. Investors edged away, unwilling to be associated with a sinking ship. And in that moment, Nathan Brooks, the man who believed he controlled the room, realized the room was slipping beyond his grasp. Because the empire he had built wasn't just cracking, it was crumbling right there in front of everyone. The ballroom had turned into a hive of whispers, the air electric with scandal. Guests huddled in corners, investors muttered urgently, and flashes from discreet cameras caught every flicker of panic on Nathan Brooks's face. Sophie Miller clung to his arm, but her grip was no longer affectionate. It was tense, calculated. She glanced at the folder Richard Hamilton had laid out, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could feel the shift. The man who had promised her a glittering throne was wobbling, his crown slipping. Nathan leaned down, his voice sharp, desperate. "Stand by me. Smile. They'll believe us if you smile." But Sophie wasn't listening. Her eyes darted to Richard, then to Claire. Radiant in her sapphire gown, twins nestled against her shoulders. The image was powerful, too powerful. It contrasted starkly with Sophie's own desperate posture, clutching a man who was visibly unraveling. One of Nathan's closest investors approached, face grim. "Nathan, is this true?" he demanded, pointing toward the folder. "Did you falsify reports? Did you siphon funds?" Nathan laughed hollowly. "Of course not. This is Hamilton's stunt to humiliate me. He's jealous, threatened." The investor cut him off coldly. "We'll be conducting an immediate review. Don't think this will be brushed aside." He walked away, shaking his head. Sophie's stomach churned. The whispers grew harsher. Fraud, liar, finished. She pulled her arm free from Nathan's grasp, her smile plastered on but brittle. Nathan turned on her, his eyes wild. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "I can't be dragged down with you," she whispered, her voice sugar-sweet for the watching crowd. "I have my career, my reputation. I didn't sign up to marry a criminal." Nathan's face flushed red, his composure cracking completely. "You ungrateful." But Sophie had already stepped back, creating a deliberate space between them. Her smile widened for the cameras, but her words were knives. "You've embarrassed me, Nathan. In front of everyone. I should have listened when people said you'd do anything to win, even cheat." The murmurs exploded. Guests gasped, eyes widening as Sophie, the bride, openly turned against the groom. Claire watched quietly, her lips pressing into a thin line. She wasn't surprised. She knew Sophie's loyalty was always rooted in Nathan's power, never in love. And now that power was bleeding out, Sophie was ready to abandon him. Richard remained silent, his eyes fixed on Nathan, but the faintest trace of a smirk tugged at his lips. The trap Nathan had set for Claire had ensnared him instead, and his mistress was cutting herself free before the ship sank completely. Nathan grabbed Sophie's wrist in a last, desperate attempt to hold on to control. "Don't you dare walk away from me," he snarled under his breath. Sophie wrenched free, her voice sharp enough for the nearest guests to hear. "You don't own me, Nathan, and you certainly don't deserve me, not after this." The statement landed like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed, phones flashed, and suddenly Sophie turned from accessory to accuser. She positioned herself near a group of wealthy women, sliding seamlessly into their circle as if she had always belonged there. She tilted her head, whispering just loud enough to be overheard. "Poor me, I didn't know he was such a fraud. Imagine finding out on your wedding night." The crowd ate it up. Sympathy poured toward Sophie, outrage toward Nathan. The tide had turned completely. Nathan stood abandoned, his guests dispersing, his investors doubting, and his bride betraying him in plain sight. And in that moment, Nathan Brooks realized the unthinkable. He hadn't just lost control of the night, he had lost everything. The ballroom was collapsing around Nathan Brooks. The empire he had built on arrogance and deception was unraveling in the very place he had hoped to flaunt it. His investors were backing away. Sophie had betrayed him, and Richard Hamilton stood tall as the man who revealed his lies. But Nathan's pride would not let him fall quietly. His face twisted red, his voice booming over the murmurs. "Enough of this," he roared, slamming his hand against the champagne table, sending glasses clattering to the floor. The sound silenced the room. Every eye turned to him, not with respect, but with morbid fascination, like witnesses watching a fire consume a house. Nathan's glare locked on Claire. "This is your fault," he spat, pointing at her with a trembling finger. "You think you've won something tonight? You think showing up here in a borrowed dress with a billionaire on your arm makes you better than me? You're nothing, Claire. You've always been nothing." The words hung in the air, cruel and venomous. A few guests gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. Sophie smirked faintly from across the room, glad to see Nathan tearing himself apart. But Claire stood still, her twins nestled close, her sapphire gown glinting under the chandeliers. Her heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. She had heard these words before, whispered in their home, shouted in their fights, etched into the silence of her loneliest nights. And now, in front of the world, Nathan had given her the stage to answer them once and for all. Her voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of years of pain. "You're right, Nathan. I was nothing, because you worked every day to make me believe that. You took my love, my loyalty, my dreams, and you crushed them so you could feel bigger. You left me alone, carrying twins, with no money, no home, no support. You threw me away like trash." The room was silent except for the soft cries of Lily, startled by her mother's trembling voice. Claire kissed her daughter's forehead, then looked back at Nathan, her eyes fierce. "But here's the truth you never understood. I didn't stay nothing. I learned how to survive. I cleaned floors, folded clothes, worked until my hands bled. I raised these children with every ounce of strength I had. And do you know what? I became more without you than I ever was with you." Gasps filled the air, followed by a wave of murmurs. Guests nodded, some even clapping softly, moved by her raw honesty. Nathan's face twisted, his pride shriveling under the weight of her truth. Claire stepped closer, her voice rising, not in anger, but in conviction. "You thought you erased me, but all you did was free me. You lost the best thing you ever had, Nathan, and tonight the world sees it too." Richard's hand rested gently on her shoulder, his eyes full of pride. The twins clung tighter to her, symbols of her strength and resilience. Nathan's mouth opened, but no words came. His rage sputtered, his control shattered. He looked around the room for an ally, but there were none left. Sophie had abandoned him, his investors doubted him, and the crowd's sympathy lay firmly with the woman he had tried to destroy. And in that silence, the truth became undeniable. Nathan Brooks hadn't exposed Claire Johnson as nothing. He had exposed himself as everything he always feared, weak, pathetic, and utterly alone. The ballroom air felt electric, thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. Nathan Brooks stood exposed, his fury sputtering into silence. Claire Johnson, once the woman he discarded, now stood radiant, her children nestled against her, her truth ringing in every corner of the plaza. The crowd murmured with admiration for her strength. But then Richard Hamilton stepped forward. The billionaire's presence alone was enough to silence the room. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his voice deep and commanding as it echoed beneath the chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping the crowd, "tonight you've seen the truth of Nathan Brooks. But more importantly, you've seen the truth of Claire Johnson." All eyes shifted to Claire, who blinked in shock. She had expected support in private, but not this. Richard continued, his words deliberate, powerful. "When Nathan abandoned her, when he left her with nothing but 2 unborn children, she didn't crumble. She didn't beg. She fought. She worked. She sacrificed every comfort so those children could have a life. That is not weakness. That is strength. That is dignity." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling louder. Guests who moments ago had whispered doubts were now nodding, clapping, some even standing. Nathan's face twisted, his voice rising in panic. "You don't know what you're talking about. She's manipulating you." Richard's voice thundered over him. "Manipulation? No, Nathan. What she endured would have broken most people. And yet here she stands, not only unbroken, but stronger than ever. And I, for one, will not let her stand alone any longer." A stunned silence fell. Claire's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to Richard, eyes wide, as he looked at her with a steady, unwavering gaze. "I will stand with Claire Johnson," Richard declared, his voice firm, reverent. "As her partner, as her supporter, and as her protector. She and her children deserve a life free of cruelty and humiliation, and I will ensure they have it." Gasps echoed through the room. The crowd erupted in whispers, half in shock, half in awe. Did he just? He's claiming her? In front of everyone? Nathan staggered back, his face pale. This was the nightmare he hadn't imagined. Not only had Claire survived, she had found an ally in one of the most powerful men in America. Sophie, watching from the sidelines, stiffened in disbelief. She had fought to replace Claire, to wear the crown Claire once had, only to watch it placed back on Claire's head by a man whose influence dwarfed Nathan's. Claire, overwhelmed, shook her head faintly. "Richard, you don't have to," but he gently interrupted, his voice low, meant only for her ears. "I want to. Because you deserve more than surviving. You deserve to live." Her eyes filled with tears, not of despair, but of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The guests, caught between scandal and admiration, applauded again, louder this time. Some shouted her name, others clapped until the ballroom echoed with support. The tide had fully turned. Claire wasn't just surviving Nathan's attempt at humiliation, she was ascending above it. And as Nathan watched, trembling with rage and disbelief, the truth struck him with brutal clarity. The woman he discarded had not only risen, she had found someone powerful enough to ensure he could never drag her down again. The thunder of applause still echoed off the ballroom walls, but Nathan Brooks heard nothing except the blood pounding in his ears. His wedding had become a spectacle, not of triumph, but of his humiliation. His ex-wife glowed like a queen. Richard Hamilton had claimed her openly. And the crowd, the very people Nathan had invited to admire him, were applauding her strength instead of his success. His face burned crimson, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. He could feel control slipping through his hands like water. And when Nathan Brooks felt cornered, he lashed out. "Stop!" he bellowed, his voice cracking across the room. The applause faded into uneasy silence, the orchestra stuttering into stillness. All eyes turned back to him. His chest heaved as he pointed a trembling finger at Claire. "You think this changes anything? You think dressing up in a fancy gown and clinging to a billionaire erases who you really are? You're still nothing but a poor, desperate woman who couldn't survive without me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some guests frowned, others exchanged disgusted glances. But Nathan wasn't finished. His rage poured out in a flood. "You wouldn't even be standing here if it weren't for me," he spat. "I made you. I gave you everything you had. And now you walk in here pretending you've moved on? No, you're a parasite, Claire. That's all you'll ever be." Claire's lips parted, but before she could respond, Richard stepped forward, his presence radiating calm authority. His deep voice cut through Nathan's hysteria like a blade. "Careful, Brooks. The more you speak, the more you reveal the truth, that you can't stand the fact she rose without you." The crowd murmured in agreement. Nathan's eyes darted wildly, desperate for allies, but found none. Even Sophie stood apart, her arms crossed, her face twisted in disdain. She wanted no part of his collapse. But Nathan's desperation only grew. He lunged toward the table where Richard's folder lay, snatching it up and waving it wildly. "This is lies," he shouted. "Fabricated. He's trying to destroy me because he's jealous." Richard remained composed. "Those documents are already in the hands of your board members and federal investigators. Shred them here if you like. It won't change the truth." Nathan's hand shook, the papers fluttering as he realized he was cornered. His gaze snapped back to Claire, venom dripping from his words. "And you, don't think you've won. You're nothing without me. Nothing." Claire finally spoke, her voice steady, her eyes unflinching. "Nathan, you left me with nothing, and I built a life anyway. That's something you'll never understand." The words struck harder than any scream. The room exhaled as if it had been holding its breath. Guests nodded, some clapped softly. Nathan's mouth opened, but no sound came. His rage had sputtered into silence. He looked around, desperate for one sympathetic face, but found only judgment. The empire he had flaunted was collapsing, not tomorrow, not next week, now. And as the weight of his downfall pressed in on him, Nathan Brooks finally realized the truth. He wasn't the man in control of this night. He was the spectacle, the cautionary tale, the fool who handed the crown back to the woman he tried to destroy. The ballroom was still buzzing with whispers when the sound of heavy doors swinging open echoed through the plaza. The murmurs died instantly. Uniformed police officers strode into the glittering hall, their presence cutting through the glamour like a knife. Behind them, two plainclothes detectives carried leather folders and stern expressions. The crowd gasped. This wasn't part of the spectacle Nathan had planned. "Mr. Nathan Brooks," one detective announced, his voice firm, echoing off the marble walls. Nathan froze, his blood ran cold. "What is this?" he barked, forcing a laugh that trembled. "This is a wedding, not—" "You are under investigation for securities fraud, embezzlement, and wire fraud," the detective continued. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Guests clutched their pearls, investors muttered furiously, and cameras clicked with renewed frenzy. The grand event Nathan had staged to show off his power was becoming the stage of his public downfall. Nathan's face turned crimson. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is a setup. Hamilton's behind this. You can't arrest me in front of all these people." But the detectives didn't flinch. They stepped forward, their presence calm but unyielding. One officer pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The sound of the metal clicking open echoed louder than the orchestra ever had. Sophie, standing to the side, covered her mouth with a theatrical gasp. "Oh my God," she whispered, though her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. She had already distanced herself from Nathan, and now she played the role of the innocent bride betrayed. The sympathy that Nathan had craved now flowed toward her instead. Nathan turned frantically toward the crowd. "You all know me. You've done business with me. Tell them this is a mistake." But the crowd stayed silent. Investors crossed their arms, journalists scribbled notes, and old friends turned their faces away. No one stepped forward. Then Nathan's eyes landed on Claire. Desperation twisted his face. "Claire," he shouted, "tell them I'm not a monster. Tell them I took care of you. You owe me that much." Claire's heart pounded, but her gaze was steady. She shook her head softly, her voice clear. "I don't owe you anything, Nathan, not anymore." The detectives moved in, seizing Nathan by the arms. He thrashed wildly, his voice rising into a shriek. "No, you can't do this to me. I'm Nathan Brooks. I built this city." "I am." His words were cut short by the cold snap of handcuffs around his wrists. The crowd gasped again, some covering their mouths, others lifting their phones higher to capture the moment. Richard stepped closer to Claire, his hand steady on her shoulder. "It's over," he murmured. Tears stung Claire's eyes, but they weren't from sorrow. They were from relief. For years she had carried the scars of Nathan's cruelty, his abandonment, his attempts to erase her. And now, in front of the very people he had wanted to impress, he was the one erased. The detectives began to lead Nathan away. His shouts echoed down the marble hall, growing weaker as the distance grew. "You'll regret this. All of you. You'll regret." But no one listened. The doors shut behind him and silence fell over the ballroom. In that silence, the truth was undeniable. Nathan Brooks had planned a wedding to prove his power. Instead, it became the stage of his public execution, not by death, but by disgrace. The doors of the Plaza ballroom closed with a heavy thud behind the detectives. Nathan Brooks's furious shouts faded into silence, leaving behind only the hum of whispers and the weight of scandal. For a moment, the grand hall seemed suspended, glittering chandeliers casting light on a room full of uneasy faces. And then, all eyes shifted to Sophie Miller. She had been left at the altar, not by choice, but by disgrace. Her groom was being hauled away in handcuffs, his reputation shattered, his empire crumbling. The sympathy that might have gone to him now hovered, waiting to see where she would fall. Sophie understood this better than anyone. She had built her life on reading a room, on molding herself into what people wanted. And tonight, she knew survival meant cutting herself free from Nathan completely. She dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her lips trembling just enough to look believable. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He lied to me, just like he lied to everyone." The crowd leaned in, eager for the performance. A cluster of wealthy women gathered near her, their eyes wide with sympathy. One reached out, squeezing Sophie's arm. "You poor thing," she murmured. "To find out on your wedding night." Sophie sniffled, lowering her gaze. "He told me he was building a future for us. I thought I was marrying a man of honor. Instead, I was just another pawn in his game." The words dripped with rehearsed sorrow, but the effect was powerful. Guests who had moments ago been scandalized now rallied around her, nodding in pity. Cameras clicked, capturing her tear-streaked face, already framing the headline, "Betrayed Bride Stands Alone." Across the room, Claire watched silently, her twins nestled against her shoulders. She recognized the act for what it was. Sophie wasn't grieving Nathan. She was saving herself. Still, Claire couldn't help but feel a flicker of grim satisfaction. Sophie had once laughed at her pain, mocked her poverty, and flaunted the life stolen from her. Now Sophie stood alone, her crown slipping just as Nathan's had. Richard leaned close, his voice quiet but firm. "She's already rewriting the story. Let her. The more she distances herself from him, the more she condemns him." Sophie straightened, her tears slowing. She turned to the crowd, her voice soft but steady. "I want to apologize to all of you for believing in him, for standing by him. I see now that Nathan Brooks is not the man I thought he was. I won't be tied to his crimes." A murmur of approval rippled through the guests. They nodded, accepting her as a victim rather than an accomplice. In a single evening, Sophie had managed to pivot from a glittering bride to a betrayed survivor. But not everyone was convinced. Some whispered doubts lingered, questions about how much Sophie had really known. And though she smiled through her tears, her eyes darted often to Claire, jealous, resentful, unable to bear the sight of the woman who had stolen the night from her. Claire met her gaze calmly, without malice. She didn't need to say a word. Sophie's betrayal of Nathan spoke louder than anything else. The orchestra began to play softly again, as though trying to restore dignity to the shattered night. Guests returned to their champagne, though the topic on every lip was the same: the downfall of Nathan Brooks, the resilience of Claire Johnson, and the spectacle Sophie had made of herself. And as Sophie basked in her carefully staged sympathy, she failed to notice one truth settling in the room. No matter how much she tried to rewrite her story, Sophie Miller would always be remembered as the woman who stood beside Nathan Brooks when his empire fell. The ballroom, still humming with whispers about Nathan's downfall and Sophie's theatrics, began to settle. Waiters quietly refilled glasses, the orchestra played a hesitant melody, and yet, beneath the gilded chandeliers, the atmosphere was different. Charged, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. In the center of it all stood Claire Johnson. Her twins, Ethan and Lily, rested their sleepy heads on her shoulders, their tiny hands curled into the fabric of her sapphire gown. For years she had shielded them from the weight of her struggles, burying her pain so they would never feel it. But now, as the storm of the evening slowly calmed, Claire felt the walls around her heart crack. Richard's hand remained steady on her back, anchoring her in the chaos. He leaned closer, his voice low and reassuring. "It's over, Claire. You don't have to fight anymore." The words pierced something deep inside her. She had spent so long in survival mode, working double shifts, skipping meals, enduring sleepless nights, hiding her tears in the dark so her children wouldn't see. Every day had been a battle, every step a fight to prove she could endure without Nathan. And now, in front of the very people who once might have judged her, the truth was laid bare. She had endured, she had risen, and she had won. Her chest tightened, her eyes stung, and before she could stop herself, tears spilled down her cheeks. But these weren't the silent tears of despair she had shed alone in her tiny apartment. These were tears of release, tears of freedom. Guests watched in silence, their hearts moved. They didn't see weakness in her tears. They saw victory. They saw a mother who had carried the impossible, and now finally allowed herself to feel the weight lift. Claire kissed the tops of her children's heads, her voice trembling. "We're free, my loves. We're finally free." The words were soft, but they carried across the room, striking a chord in everyone who heard them. A few guests even wiped their own eyes. Claire's story, once meant to be a cautionary tale of failure, had become a testament to resilience. Richard gently brushed a tear from her cheek. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," he whispered. Claire looked at him, her vision blurred with tears but her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in years, she believed him. She wasn't alone. She had allies. She had hope. The orchestra shifted to a softer tune, as though underscoring the moment. Guests began to clap, not the polite applause of earlier, but something deeper, an acknowledgement, a standing ovation for her journey. One by one, people rose to their feet, clapping louder, until the entire ballroom echoed with thunderous support. Claire pressed her hand to her heart, overwhelmed. She had been the woman cast aside, the mother struggling in shadows. Now she stood in the light, not because of wealth or beauty, but because of her strength and her truth. The tears kept flowing, but they no longer shamed her. They healed her. Each drop washed away the years of cruelty, the nights of hunger, the loneliness of raising children without support. She was no longer the abandoned wife. She was Claire Johnson, the woman who survived, who rose, who triumphed. And as the applause roared around her, Claire knew with absolute certainty. Her tears were no longer for what she had lost. They were for the life she had finally won. The applause still thundered through the ballroom, echoing against marble pillars and glittering chandeliers. Claire Johnson stood in its center, her cheeks damp with tears, her twins clinging to her shoulders, her heart light for the first time in years. She had endured Nathan's cruelty, Sophie's mockery, society's judgment, and she had risen above them all. But the night was not finished. Richard Hamilton, who had stood quietly at her side, watching with pride as she reclaimed her dignity, took a slow step forward. The applause began to fade as guests noticed the change in his posture, the intent in his eyes. One by one, voices hushed, and the room fell silent again, waiting. Richard turned to Claire, his deep gaze steady, his expression softer than anyone had ever seen on the usually impenetrable billionaire. He reached into his jacket, and when he pulled out a small velvet box, gasps echoed through the hall. Claire's breath caught, her eyes widened. "Richard, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard lowered himself onto one knee, the contrast of his powerful figure kneeling on the marble floor striking every witness like a lightning bolt. He opened the box, revealing a ring that sparkled beneath the chandeliers. A diamond, not just large but brilliant, set with elegance, a symbol of devotion rather than wealth. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs. Phones lifted, cameras flashed, and whispers darted across the room like wildfire. "A proposal? Here? Tonight?" Richard's voice carried steady and strong, cutting through the noise. "Claire Johnson," he began, his tone reverent, "I have watched you face more cruelty than any woman should ever endure. I have seen the strength in your spirit, the love in your heart, and the courage with which you've raised your children. You don't need me, you've already proven you can stand on your own, but I want to stand with you, not as your rescuer, but as your partner." Claire's hands trembled as she clutched her children tighter. Her heart raced, her mind spinning. Never had she expected this, not tonight, not ever. She had come prepared for humiliation, not for honor. Richard's eyes softened, his voice dropping into something intimate, though every person in the ballroom leaned in to catch it. "Claire, will you marry me? Will you allow me to walk beside you, to protect you, to cherish you, and to love not only you, but the children who are part of you? Will you give me the honor of calling us a family?" Tears flooded Claire's eyes again, but these were different. Tears of disbelief, of gratitude, of overwhelming love. Ethan stirred in her arms, clapping his tiny hands as though sensing the importance of the moment. Lily giggled softly, her voice breaking the silence with innocence. The ballroom exploded into applause once more, louder than before, cheering, whistling, urging her on. Strangers shouted her name, women dabbed at their eyes, men nodded with approval. It was the kind of proposal that lived in stories. Unforgettable, immortal. Claire pressed a trembling hand to her lips, overwhelmed. For years, she had dreamed only of survival, of making it one more day, one more night. Now, in front of the very people who once looked down on her, she was being offered something she thought she'd lost forever. Love, respect, family. Her voice shook, but it carried across the hall. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, her heart breaking open with joy. "Yes, Richard, I will." The crowd erupted, cheers echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Richard rose, slipping the ring onto her finger, then drew her and the twins into his embrace. The four of them stood together, framed by chandeliers, a new family forged in the ashes of betrayal. And as the cameras flashed and the applause roared, the truth was undeniable. Claire Johnson had walked into the plaza, expecting shame. She walked out with love, dignity, and a future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. The applause inside the plaza was deafening, echoing long after Richard slipped the ring onto Claire's trembling hand. Strangers stood on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. The image of Claire Johnson, once the poor abandoned wife, now standing hand in hand with one of the most powerful men in America, her twins nestled safely against her, would be remembered long after the last champagne glass was cleared. But for Claire, the noise faded. All she felt was peace. She looked down at her children. Ethan giggled, tugging at the sparkling ring on her finger. Lily pressed her cheek against Claire's shoulder, cooing softly. For the first time since their birth, Claire didn't feel the heavy ache of fear for their future. She felt light, free, and safe. Richard leaned close, his voice warm against her ear. "This is the start of something new. You'll never carry the weight alone again." Tears filled her eyes, but this time she didn't fight them. She let them flow, knowing they weren't tears of weakness but of healing. She whispered back, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." The orchestra swelled, and the guests began to toast, not to Nathan, not to Sophie, but to Claire and Richard. Glasses clinked, laughter rose, and the atmosphere transformed from scandal to celebration. The very night Nathan had intended as her humiliation had become her coronation. Meanwhile, whispers of Nathan's arrest rippled beyond the ballroom. Phones buzzed with alerts, journalists scribbled furiously, headlines forming even before the ink dried. Nathan Brooks, arrested on fraud charges. His empire was finished. Sophie, clinging to the role of betrayed bride, faded into the background, forgotten as the world's attention shifted entirely to Claire. Claire looked around the room, seeing faces she once thought sneered at her now glowing with admiration. But deep down, she knew her victory wasn't in their approval. It was in the fact that she had survived, endured, and risen without losing herself. She raised her glass, her voice carrying across the hall. I once thought I was nothing, that I had no strength, no future. But tonight, I stand here with proof that no matter how far someone tries to break you, you can rise again, not just for yourself, but for those you love. The room erupted in cheers, clapping until the chandeliers trembled. Claire lowered her glass, holding her children close, her heart finally at peace. Richard kissed her temple, and together they walked toward the grand doors of the plaza. Guests followed behind, the atmosphere alive with joy. Outside, flashes from cameras lit up the night sky, capturing the image of a woman who had gone from discarded to celebrated. Claire paused at the steps, inhaling the crisp New York air. The city that once felt so cruel now seemed full of promise. She looked down at Ethan and Lily, their innocent eyes wide with wonder, and whispered, "This is our new beginning." The limousine waited, but Claire no longer felt like a passenger in someone else's story. She was the author now, ready to write a future brighter than any past she had endured. As the car door closed and the city lights reflected in the glass, one truth settled deep in her heart. She had walked into the plaza as the woman Nathan tried to erase. She left it as the woman no one would ever forget. So that's how our story comes to an end. My dear friends, if you're still here with me right now, it means something in this journey touched your heart in its own quiet way. Maybe you saw a little of Claire's struggle in your own life. Those nights of doubt, the weight of being underestimated, or the fight to stand tall when the world seems determined to keep you small. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." And isn't that the truth we just witnessed? Claire's strength didn't come from avoiding pain, it came from enduring it, transforming it, and rising above it. Her tears became her freedom. Her scars became her crown. So tonight, let's carry that lesson with us. No betrayal, no setback, no cruel voice can define you unless you let it. You have the power to rise. And if this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope tonight, and subscribe so you can keep walking these journeys with us. Because together, we're not just watching stories. We're healing, one heart at a time. The Plaza Hotel in New York City gleamed like a palace that evening, its grand chandeliers spilling golden light across the marble floors. Tonight, it wasn't just a wedding, it was a spectacle. At the center of it all stood Nathan Brooks, the charming yet arrogant groom, wearing a smug grin that seemed carved into his face. Beside him, Sophie Miller, his glamorous young fiancée, clutched his arm like she had already conquered the world. But Nathan had more than marriage on his mind. He had planned a show. He wanted revenge. Only a year earlier, his ex-wife, Claire Johnson, had walked out of his life carrying not just heartbreak but his children, twins, barely a year old now. He had abandoned her when she was most vulnerable, taking the house, the savings, and leaving her with nothing but two fragile lives to protect. And yet, he wasn't satisfied with her suffering. He wanted her humiliation to be public, unforgettable. "Send her an invitation," Nathan had told Sophie weeks ago, his voice dripping with cruelty. "Let her walk into this ballroom looking tired, broke, and desperate. Let everyone see the difference between her misery and my success." Sophie had smirked. "She'll crumble the moment she sees us, and the cameras will love it." And so the golden-trimmed envelope was delivered to Claire's tiny apartment. Everyone in Nathan's circle knew the truth. This wasn't an act of kindness. It was bait. He wanted her to appear as a shadow of herself while he basked in luxury, every guest whispering that he had traded up. As the string quartet played, Nathan raised his glass, savoring the anticipation. When she walks in, he whispered to Sophie, the world will know I won. But the guests weren't as convinced. Whispers floated through the crowd. Would Claire dare to come? Would she face the man who abandoned her and flaunted his betrayal? Or would she stay hidden, confirming Nathan's victory without even showing up? The room buzzed with shallow laughter and curiosity. Nathan was sure of himself. He believed Claire would crawl, broken and ashamed. What he didn't know was that the woman he once discarded was no longer the same. And when the doors opened that night, the humiliation he planned would turn into his greatest downfall. Before the glitter of the plaza and the cruel whispers of high society, there was a small, dim apartment in Queens where Claire Johnson's life had been reduced to survival. She had once believed in fairy tales. Once believed that Nathan Brooks was her prince, her forever. At 24, she married him, carrying nothing into their union but love, loyalty, and the quiet dream of a family. For a while, Nathan played the role well. He showered her with flowers, whispered promises, and painted pictures of a future filled with travel, success, and children. Claire, innocent and trusting, gave up her part-time job as a receptionist to support his rising career. She became the perfect wife, cooking meals, managing their home, and standing proudly by his side at every corporate event. But as Nathan's wealth and ambition grew, so did his contempt. He began to look at Claire not as a partner, but as baggage. He mocked her plain clothes, criticized her for not fitting in with the glamorous wives of his colleagues, and reminded her often that without him, she was nothing. The breaking point came when Claire discovered she was pregnant, not with one child, but with twins. She had cried with joy, believing that this was the miracle that would heal their marriage. She imagined Nathan holding her hand at doctor's appointments, painting nurseries, whispering to her swollen belly. But Nathan's reaction was ice. "Twins?" he scoffed, his lip curling. "Do you have any idea how expensive that will be? You can't even provide for yourself, Claire, and now you expect me to carry the weight of 2 more mouths to feed?" From that moment, his cruelty sharpened. Nights grew long and lonely as Nathan stayed out late, coming home with excuses that smelled of perfume and lies. Claire begged him to be present, begged him to remember the vows they had made, but his patience wore thin. One evening, when her belly was heavy and her body ached, Nathan shoved her suitcase into her hands and spat the words that would haunt her forever. "You've ruined my life. Get out." And just like that, she was gone. No home, no savings, no husband. Only the weight of unborn twins pressing against her ribs and the crushing fear of what tomorrow would bring. Claire moved into a friend's spare room, then into a cramped apartment where peeling paint and leaky pipes became her reality. She worked wherever she could, cleaning offices at night, folding laundry at corner shops during the day, even babysitting for strangers. Her hands blistered from harsh chemicals, her feet swelled from standing too long, her eyes burned from lack of sleep. And when the twins were born, 1 boy, 1 girl, her exhaustion doubled. Claire spent nights rocking them both, humming lullabies with a voice that cracked from tears. She skipped meals so she could buy formula, wore second-hand clothes while strangers whispered about her in grocery store lines, and endured the judgment of a world that saw her not as a mother fighting to survive, but as a failure abandoned by her husband. The cruelest part wasn't the poverty. It was the silence. Nathan never called, never visited, never once asked about the children who carried his name. He flaunted his new life with Sophie in magazines, smiling on yachts while Claire counted pennies for diapers. Every night, Claire whispered to her babies, "I will not fail you. Even if I have to break, I will protect you." She kissed their tiny hands, promising them a love stronger than any cruelty. And though her heart shattered piece by piece, somewhere in the rubble, something new was forged. Resilience. Because Claire Johnson wasn't just a poor, discarded ex-wife. She was a mother. And a mother's love can build kingdoms from ashes. And the night Nathan tried to shame her would be the night the world saw just how unbreakable she had become. The Plaza Hotel was more than a wedding venue. It was Nathan Brooks's stage. From the moment he booked the gilded ballroom, dripping with chandeliers and marble columns, he saw it as more than a ceremony. It would be his declaration to the world that he had moved on, risen higher, and erased the woman who once stood beside him. Sophie Miller loved the idea. She was 26, ambitious, and hungry for fame. Once a struggling model, she now preened at the thought of cameras flashing her diamond-covered hand, her designer gown making headlines. But her crown would not feel complete until Claire was crushed beneath it. "Invite her," Sophie urged one night, lounging across silk sheets in their penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city sparkled outside, but her smirk was brighter, sharper. "Make sure she comes. Imagine it. Her walking in with some cheap dress, those babies on her hip, looking like she's begging for scraps. The contrast will be perfect." Nathan's grin spread slowly, cruel and satisfied. "Oh, she'll come. Pride will drag her here, even if she knows she shouldn't. And when she does, I'll make sure everyone sees how far she's fallen." The plan unfolded in whispers and laughter between them. Invitations embossed with gold trim were sent to New York's elite: politicians, investors, celebrities, and journalists who lived for gossip. Among those invitations, one glimmered like a dagger in Claire's mailbox. Nathan didn't just want her to witness his success, he wanted her to walk into a trap. Every detail was calculated. He instructed the wedding planner to leave an empty seat near the back. "For my ex-wife, if she bothers to show." Sophie, with her venomous charm, told photographers exactly where to aim when Claire arrived. "Make sure she's in the background of every photo," she purred, "like a shadow, invisible compared to me." Nathan even scripted his toast. He would raise a glass in front of hundreds of guests and say, "Some of us had to carry more than our fair share until we found true love. Tonight, I'm grateful I finally found someone who makes me whole." The crowd would laugh, knowing he was mocking Claire, while Sophie basked in victory. The cruelty deepened with every flourish. Nathan ordered the caterer to prepare a table near the back with nothing special. No champagne, no extravagant centerpiece, just enough to remind Claire of her place. "She belongs in the shadows," he sneered. To Sophie, the thought of Claire showing up weak and humiliated was intoxicating. "When the tabloids write about this wedding, they won't just talk about us," she said, eyes gleaming. "They'll talk about her. How pathetic she looked, how irrelevant she is, and by comparison, I'll shine even brighter." Nathan kissed her hand, smug as ever. "Exactly. She'll finally understand she's nothing without me, and everyone else will see it too." But behind the laughter and champagne glasses, a tension hummed. Some of Nathan's closest friends exchanged uneasy glances when he bragged about his plan. "Isn't it a little harsh?" one asked cautiously. Nathan only smirked. "Life is harsh. She should have thought about that before ruining mine." He didn't know it yet, but the stage he polished for humiliation was about to collapse under his feet. Because Claire Johnson, the woman he thought would crawl into his wedding broken and ashamed, wasn't planning to crawl at all. She was preparing to walk in with a strength he never imagined, and a companion who would turn his perfect plan into his ultimate downfall. The night before Nathan's glittering wedding, Claire Johnson sat in the dim light of her tiny Bronx apartment, her world reduced to the hum of an old refrigerator and the soft cries of her one-year-old twins. The walls were thin, paint-chipped, and the radiator clanged as if mocking her exhaustion. She sat hunched over the kitchen table, staring at the gold-trimmed wedding invitation that had arrived weeks ago. It looked almost obscene against the scratched wood, the elegant script spelling out Nathan's name beside Sophie Miller's. She had touched the card 100 times, sometimes with trembling rage, other times with despair. She had wanted to throw it away, even burn it, but something inside her couldn't. The invitation wasn't just paper, it was a reminder of how far she had fallen, and how cruel Nathan still was. Her son Ethan whimpered from the crib, his cheeks flushed. He had been sick for 2 days, feverish and restless. Claire rose quickly, rocking him gently, whispering lullabies through cracked lips. Beside him, his twin sister Lily stirred and began to cry. Claire's arms ached as she gathered them both, swaying slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Shh, my babies," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mommy's here. Mommy won't let you down." But in her heart, doubt gnawed. She was running out of money for medicine, behind on rent, and stretched thinner than she thought possible. She had skipped meals so her children could eat. She worked nights scrubbing office floors and days folding clothes at a laundromat, stealing moments of rest only when the twins napped. Her hands were raw, her back stiff, her spirit frayed. And now this. Nathan's cruel spectacle waiting at the plaza. She imagined walking into that ballroom with her plain dress, her children clinging to her side, every wealthy guest staring, whispering, "There's the poor ex-wife. Look at her now, pitiful." She imagined Sophie's smirk, Nathan's smug toast, the laughter of 100 strangers. The humiliation would be unbearable. Claire pressed the invitation to her chest and sobbed silently. "Why me? Why did he get everything and I got left with nothing?" Her voice cracked, swallowed by the emptiness of the apartment. She thought of refusing, of staying hidden. It would be safer, less painful. No one would mock her if she didn't show. But another voice inside whispered, "If you run now, you'll always run. If you hide, he wins forever." Claire sank onto the couch, her twins in her arms, rocking them until they drifted back into uneasy sleep. She closed her eyes, exhaustion dragging her under. In her dreams, she saw Nathan's sneer, Sophie's laughter, and her own reflection, weak, invisible, erased. She jolted awake near dawn, her cheeks wet with tears. The city outside was still dark, the sound of distant traffic carrying through the window. She looked at her children, their tiny chests rising and falling, their innocence untouched by the cruelty of the world. And she made a quiet promise, one that rose from the ashes of her despair. "I will not let him erase me. I will not let him erase us." She didn't yet know how she would keep that promise. She didn't yet know who would soon step into her life and change everything. But that night, as the rain tapped against the window, the seed of defiance took root in her weary heart. And by the time the wedding doors opened, Claire Johnson would no longer be the broken woman Nathan expected. She would be the storm that destroyed his perfect illusion.